In a previous video, I showed an example of where I make an API call when I'm trying to test this API, and there's two ways to validate. One is make another API call to fetch the data you just created, or go directly into the database and run SQL and get the data. So here I want to talk about when to use which one. What I said in the previous video is most of the time you want to do both. If you want to be thorough with your testing, you want to run both things, but make sure you make an API call, make sure the API gets the information. Also go to the database and make sure the data looks right in the database. One of the reasons would be the API might actually massage the data in one way or another, might reformat it, but the database is the source of truth. So going to the database in addition to checking the API will give you a much stronger test. Another is basically you don't have access to the database when you're running in production. In prod, at least in my experience in production, we don't have access to the database, but the API we do, especially if it's a get call, that which we call a non-destructive test, where you're testing something but you're not changing any data. So that's a non-destructive test, and usually you're able to run those in prod. Sometimes they don't allow you because you mess up analytics, but especially if it's a backend test, usually you can make get calls and that's okay. So in that scenario, you don't have a choice but to use the API. You make a post call, you make a get call, even though you usually don't do a post call in prod just to test. But the biggest scenario where you have to go to the database is when you don't have an API. A lot of times, especially in my experience, I make an API call, a post call to create something, but there's no get call, right? That post call might be to trigger a job, to trigger some kind of process, to create some data that there is no use case to fetch it, so there's no API to fetch it. In that case, the only option you have is to actually go to the database, assuming the API is writing into the database, right? The API might be writing a file into an S3, into a Google Drive, who knows, right? But whatever the API is supposed to do, you actually go there and do it. And if you're doing this in automation, then that's what your automation does. You write a Python script or a JavaScript or Java code that will go to the database, connect to the database, and make sure it is there. So those are the scenarios. There's no blanket, use both, or use the SQL, or use the API. It all depends on the situation. So on interviews, that's really what you have to think about. That's how you have to answer. You have to say it all depends on the situation. It depends on how thorough I want to be. Do I care about data integrity? Is there caching, right? Do I want to make sure caching works? Because APIs work with caching, and by doing extra tests, you validate that the caching is working. There's a lot more you can do by validating both the database as well as the API response. All right, hopefully that was helpful. What I do is content related to QA automation, testing, AI, and things like that. So make sure you give me a follow if you like content like that.